The March morning began with the sort of sunlight that promised spring but delivered none of its warmth. It spilled politely through the lace curtains of the Beresfords' sitting room, touching the teacups, the half-read newspaper, and the general air of cheerful disarray that marked the home of two people who had long ago decided that adventure was worth more than order. Tuppence sat cross-legged on the sofa, the post spread before her like a deck of cards, sorting each envelope with the solemnity of a fortune-teller. "Bills, advertisements, invitations to things we can't afford," she murmured. "And one that looks interesting, handwritten, expensive paper, and military penmanship. That's not a recipe for peace and quiet, Tommy." Her husband looked up from the morning paper. "Which we were enjoying perfectly well, thank you," he said. "We've only just paid off the carpet. Whatever it is, put it down before it recruits us." Tuppence ignored him, slicing the envelope open with the fruit knife. The handwriting was indeed familiar, bold, slanted, and efficient. "Well, well," she said, her tone sharpening. "Colonel Haydock, do you remember him?" Tommy frowned, the name stirring memories of muddy fields and messages whispered over campfires. Good heavens, yes. Haydock of the intelligence, a bulldog of a man, never smiled if he could help it. Apparently he's still alive and still frowning. "Listen," she began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, you may find this an odd communication after so many years, but time has a way of leaving unfinished business behind. I find myself haunted by such a matter, an incident during the war concerning a nurse named Lydia Benton, whose death was deemed accidental. I have reason to believe otherwise. If you value curiosity over comfort, come to Mapleford at once. There is something here that requires clear eyes and steady nerves. I trust you still possess both." She lowered the letter and looked at Tommy with the gleam that usually preceded catastrophe. "Well?" Tommy exhaled. He might have written to the police or to anyone sensible. Why us? "Because, my dear, we're interesting." She folded the letter with exaggerated care. "We haven't done anything interesting for months. You're getting domesticated. I caught you reading about home insurance yesterday." "That was for a friend," he protested weakly. Tuppence rose, pacing the rug. "Mapleford. I've never heard of it, but the name sounds suspiciously peaceful, like the sort of place where dreadful things happen behind trimmed hedges. A nurse, an accident, a letter after all these years. Oh, Tommy, it's practically begging for us." Tommy folded his newspaper. "And if I say no?" "Then I shall go alone, which would be terribly reckless of me, and you'd have to follow anyway to prevent scandal." He sighed, recognizing defeat in the sparkle of her eyes. "We'll need the motor, I suppose." "No, a train," she said firmly. "Trains are more romantic for mysteries. Besides, Mapleford sounds like the sort of place that disapproves of people arriving in noisy automobiles." While Tommy resigned himself to packing, Tuppence busied herself with preparations of her own, choosing a hat that suggested curiosity without gossip, and a coat that looked capable of both tea and pursuit. By noon they were at Paddington Station, the familiar rattle of porters and hiss of steam wrapping them in a sense of impending narrative. "Remind me again," Tommy said as they settled into their compartment, "why we keep doing this sort of thing." "Because," said Tuppence, gazing out at the passing rooftops, "we've seen what happens when people stop doing things. They start knitting things instead." The rhythm of the train lulled them into thoughtful silence. Fields rolled by, green and rain-washed, dotted with sheep and cottages that looked too innocent to hide secrets. Yet even Tommy felt that prickling anticipation, the same sense one gets before the curtain rises. He unfolded Haydock's letter again, reading the lines with a soldier's discipline. "Unfinished business," he murmured. He never was one for sentiment. If he's asking for help now, something's truly bothering him. "Which is exactly why we must go," said Tuppence. "Colonel Haydock was the sort of man who could make a volcano feel apologetic. For him to admit unease, it must be serious." They reached Mapleford by late afternoon, stepping from the train into a world of stillness. The little station looked as though it had been polished for a royal visit sometime in 1912 and then left untouched. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and river mist. A single porter, more interested in his pipe than his passengers, directed them toward the village road. Mapleford revealed itself slowly, as English villages do. Stone cottages huddled like gossiping aunts, church spire rising above a patchwork of chimneys, and hedges so neat they might have been trimmed by conscience itself. At the corner stood the Ivy Gate Inn, a cheerful establishment with lace curtains and the faint aroma of cinnamon and ale. Inside, Mrs. Glaston, the innkeeper, welcomed them with curiosity only barely concealed by civility. "A room for two, is it? You'll be wanting supper as well. We don't get many visitors this time of year, except funerals, of course." Tuppence smiled. "Let's hope we're not here for one." Mrs. Glaston chuckled uncertainly. "Oh, I do hope not, madam. Mapleford's had its share of tragedy." As she led them upstairs, Tuppence cast Tommy a glance that said, "We're in the right place." Their room overlooked the green, where a few children played marbles under the watchful gaze of a stone soldier memorial. Across the way stood a Georgian house with shuttered windows and ivy choking its walls. A blackbird perched on the gate, singing an oddly mournful tune. "That must be Benton House," said Tuppence softly. "It looks like it remembers things." "Everything here looks like it remembers things," Tommy replied. That evening, over a meal of roast lamb and treacle pudding, they discussed their next move. Colonel Haydock had written that he would meet them at the inn after dusk. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 8 when the door opened, and the man himself entered, a broad figure in a dark overcoat, his face lined like a map of old campaigns. His eyes, though still sharp, carried the weariness of someone long burdened by silence. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said, shaking their hands with deliberate gravity. "You haven't changed much. Still inquisitive, I hope." "Incorrigibly," said Tuppence. "You've lured us away from civilization, Colonel. What's this all about?" He waited until Mrs. Glaston had withdrawn before answering. "I'm not proud of this letter," he said. "It's taken me 20 years to write it. During the war, a nurse under my command, Lydia Benton, died suddenly. Everyone said heart failure. But she was young, healthy and frightened. She told me she possessed something that could ruin a man and save a country. I dismissed it. She died that night." "Did you ever discover what she meant?" Tommy asked. Haydock's jaw tightened. "No, her belongings vanished. There were rumours of a diary, of coded notes hidden among the hospital files. I tried to forget it, but lately, well, things have surfaced. A letter found in the church archives whispers among old villagers. Someone doesn't want the past disturbed." Tuppence leaned forward. "And you believe this diary still exists?" "I'm certain of it, and someone else is certain enough to keep watch on those who inquire." His eyes moved to the window where the curtains fluttered slightly in the draught. "I may have put you in danger by calling you here, but I needed minds I could trust." Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy. "Danger, unfinished business, and a lost diary," she said thoughtfully. "You make it sound almost romantic." Haydock managed a grim smile. "Romance fades. Secrets endure." When he had gone, leaving them with a list of local names and a promise to meet again in the morning, Tuppence turned to Tommy. "Well, darling, you wanted peace and quiet. I think you'll get neither." Tommy glanced out at the silent green where the moonlight fell across the ivy-choked house opposite. Somewhere a dog barked once and stopped as though silenced by memory. "No," he said softly, "but I suppose that's what we came for." Tuppence smiled, drawing the curtains closed. "Then let the curtain rise, partner. Mapleford awaits." The wind stirred the ivy outside, whispering over stone and shutter as if repeating something only the dead could understand, and in that gentle, haunting murmur lay the promise of the clue they had yet to find. Morning broke over Mapleford with a kind of shy clarity, the pale sunlight trickling through a veil of mist that clung to the cobbled streets and stone walls as if reluctant to leave. The village stirred with slow, deliberate grace, a milk cart creaking past the church, smoke rising lazily from thatched chimneys, and the occasional chime of a bicycle bell cutting through the quiet. From the window of the Ivygate Inn, Tuppence Beresford watched it all with keen delight, the sort that turns even a sleepy hamlet into a living puzzle. "Picturesque, isn't it?" she murmured, tying the belt of her robe and leaning out just far enough to catch the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. "Almost offensively so. I half expect a body to roll past just to justify it." Tommy, still wrestling with a collar stud and his own sense of reason, gave a groan. "You've a dreadful mind, Tuppence. Can't we appreciate one village without anticipating a corpse?" "Of course we can," she said airily. "But where's the fun in that?" They met Colonel Haydock promptly at 9 in the breakfast room, a man who carried his years as if they were medals, upright but weary, every movement deliberate. His uniform had been replaced by tweed, but the discipline remained. Even the way he stirred his tea seemed like a calculated maneuver. "Good of you to come," he said without preamble. "I wasn't sure you would." "We were due for a change of scenery," Tommy replied, taking a seat opposite. "You did make it sound irresistibly grim." Haydock's lips twitched into what might once have been a smile. "Grim enough, I'm afraid. Lydia Benton's death never sat right with me. The official report said heart failure, but Lydia was 26, healthy, and not prone to fainting fits. I told myself I was being sentimental, but, well, guilt has a way of growing louder with the years." Tuppence rested her chin on her hand. "And what makes you think her death was more than tragic coincidence?" Haydock hesitated, his eyes shifting toward the window where the fog still hung like a curtain. "Because of what she told me. During the war, I supervised a hospital post relay, medical staff sending and receiving correspondence to the front. We later discovered someone had used the system to smuggle coded information to enemy hands. Lydia believed she'd found the source. The next day, she was dead." "And the message?" Tommy asked. "Vanished. No trace. The diary she kept disappeared too." His voice hardened. "It was the clue we all forgot, the one that might have exposed a traitor before more men died." The silence that followed seemed to thicken the air between them. Outside, a church bell tolled, soft but insistent, as though echoing the accusation. After breakfast, the Beresfords ventured into the heart of Mapleford to begin their unofficial reconnaissance. The village green lay like a scene from an old painting. Children in short trousers playing marbles, a postmistress sweeping her steps, a cat sunning itself on a wall. It was perfect, and that perfection, Tuppence decided, was positively suspicious. At the greengrocer's, she asked for apples and gossip, and received both. Mrs. Glaston, who had abandoned her post at the inn counter to replenish her stock, leaned conspiratorially across a basket of turnips. "Lydia Benton, you say? Oh, a long time ago, dear. Tragic business, of course. Fell asleep and never woke, peaceful as anything." "But unexpected?" Tuppence prodded gently. Mrs. Glaston's smile faltered. "Best not to dwell on such things. The Lord takes who he wills. Anyway, the Benton house is let now, to a Dr. Albury. Quiet man. Keeps to himself. Does a bit of writing, I think." "About what?" "Oh, history. Or ghosts. I can never tell the difference." Tuppence paid for her apples, thanked the woman sweetly, and rejoined Tommy outside the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread did little to mask the underlying tension. "Everyone's remarkably eager to close the subject," she said, almost rehearsed. "Village instinct," Tommy replied. "They close ranks faster than a regiment under fire." They spent the afternoon strolling through Mapleford, pretending to admire the architecture while noting the small peculiarities that spoke louder than words, the curtain that twitched as they passed, the sudden silence that greeted Lydia's name, the way the postmaster turned pale when Tommy asked about wartime records. As dusk drew near, they found themselves by the churchyard, a slope of weathered stones bordered by a low stone wall. Beyond it, half veiled in mist, stood the house Mrs. Glaston had mentioned, Benton House. It loomed behind a tangle of ivy, its windows dark, the kind of place that made even the wind tread softly. "I take it that's our next destination," Tommy said, eyeing it warily. Tuppence smiled. "You're learning." But before they could cross the road, a sound interrupted them, the slow, deliberate ring of the church bell again, though no service was scheduled. They turned to see the vicar emerging from the porch, his robes flapping like restless wings. "Good evening," Tuppence called brightly. "I hope we're not trespassing." "Not at all," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Your visitors?" "For a short while. We're friends of Colonel Haydock." That earned a pause. The vicar's expression shifted, polite but strained. "Ah, then you must be here about certain old matters." "Only curious ones," said Tuppence. "You knew Miss Benton?" "Knew of her," he said quickly. "A kind soul, by all accounts. It's a pity her name should keep resurfacing. The village prefers to look forward." "How very British of it," Tommy murmured. The vicar's eyes flicked toward Benton House. "Some things are better left where they lie, Mr. Beresford. Good evening." He turned, disappearing into the gathering mist. Tuppence exhaled softly. Well, that's that then. Everyone's either terrified of ghosts or hiding something concrete. Which do you prefer? The concrete, personally. Easier to trip over. That evening, Colonel Haydock joined them again in the inn's private parlour, a small room heavy with the scent of pipe smoke and lemon polish. The single gas lamp hissed faintly as he unfolded a map on the table. Lydia worked here, he said, pointing to a dot marked Field Hospital No. 12. All correspondence from that unit passed through Mapleford before routing to London. If someone intercepted it, they had to be local. And you suspect this Dr. Albury? Tommy asked. Haydock shook his head. He's too young. His father served here as the village physician. Perhaps there's a connection, perhaps not. But if Lydia's diary exists, it's the one document that can still speak the truth. Tuppence leaned forward, eyes bright. Then we find it. He hesitated. You should understand. Mapleford keeps its secrets tightly. The villagers won't welcome questions. Colonel, she said sweetly, I've made fishmongers confess infidelities over a cup of tea. I think I'll manage a few tight-lipped villagers. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Glaston entered with a tray, setting down steaming cups of cocoa and a plate of scones. Will there be anything else, Colonel? She asked, her tone perfectly neutral. No, thank you, he said. As she left, Tuppence noticed the brief glance Mrs. Glaston cast toward the map, and how quickly she looked away. When the door shut, Tuppence murmured, You were saying about tight-lipped villagers. Haydock frowned. She was Lydia's cousin, you know. I'd forgotten that. Cousins are interesting creatures, said Tuppence. They always know more than they mean to. When the Colonel departed for the night, Tommy banked the fire and drew the curtains, while Tuppence lingered by the window, watching the lamplight outside flicker against the mist. Benton House stood across the green, silent and watchful, its ivy-clad walls glowing faintly silver under the rising moon. Tommy, she said softly, there's something about that house that doesn't breathe right. He joined her, peering through the glass. Probably the ivy choking it. Still, I suppose tomorrow we'll pay our respects to the ghost of Lydia Benton. Tuppence smiled faintly. Yes, and perhaps to the living who wish she'd stayed dead. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to come from the house itself, a sigh or a warning, dissolving into the fog as Mapleford settled into uneasy sleep. The road to Benton House wound along the edge of the village like a thread unravelling from an old spool, narrow, uneven, and half swallowed by the wild hedgerows that reached out as though trying to reclaim it. The air carried that particular stillness that precedes a storm, and even the birds seemed to watch rather than sing. Tuppence walked briskly, her gloved hand tapping the folded map against her side, while Tommy trudged beside her with a look that suggested he'd have preferred tea and a comfortable chair to country lanes and mysteries 20 years cold. You know, he said, kicking at a loose pebble, there's a perfectly good chance Colonel Haydock has simply gone soft in the head. War guilt, regret, ghosts of the past, very fashionable these days. Tuppence smiled without slowing her pace. Perhaps, but people rarely invite us to the countryside for nothing, and when they do, we find something anyway. It came into view then, Benton House, a tall Georgian structure set back from the road behind a wrought iron gate, its facade wrapped thickly in ivy that clung like green armour. The shutters were drawn on the upper floors, but a thin plume of smoke curled from one chimney, the only sign of life. Tuppence stopped to take it in. Charming in a morbid sort of way. If this were a novel, Tommy, that upper window would belong to a madwoman or a locked study full of secrets. Let's hope it's just the bathroom, he muttered. They passed through the gate, its hinges groaning like a reluctant usher, and approached the front door. Tommy raised the brass knocker, a lion's head holding a ring in its mouth, and let it fall twice. Moments later, the door opened to reveal a man in his 30s, neatly dressed, bespectacled, and carrying the faint air of someone who spends too much time alone with dusty things. Good morning, he said, his tone polite but uncertain. I'm Dr. Simon Albury. You must be the visitors Mrs. Glaston mentioned. Yes, Tuppence said with one of her disarming smiles. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. We're staying at the inn and were told you might know something about the old history of the village, particularly this house. A pause, a flicker of wariness behind the doctor's glasses, then, yes, Well, it's not a subject of much cheer, I'm afraid. But come in, if you like. I was just having tea. Inside, Benton House had the stillness of a place held in suspension. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Furniture stood as though arranged by someone imitating life rather than living it. No dust, no disorder, but no warmth either. The walls bore portraits in muted tones, stern ancestors staring into infinity. This house belonged to the Benton family for 3 generations, Aubrey said, leading them toward a sitting room. I took it last year. Quiet place for research, ideal for my work. And your work is? Tommy asked casually, taking a seat by the fire that looked decorative rather than comforting. I'm cataloguing wartime correspondence, Aubrey said. Letters from the local hospital and surrounding posts. A private commission for the county archives. How perfectly coincidental, murmured Tuppence. We've been hearing rather a lot about that hospital lately. He hesitated. Ah, yes. There was some tragedy, wasn't there? A nurse? Lydia Benton, Tuppence said lightly, though her eyes never left his face. He nodded, looking away. So I've read. Sad story. But the past is best left to the past, don't you think? Tommy laughed easily. Oh, my wife thrives on exactly the opposite principle. She collects ghosts as other women collect hats. Tommy, she said sweetly, do stop exaggerating. She rose, ostensibly to admire the mantel clock. This is a lovely room, Dr. Aubrey. I can see why you'd find it inspiring, such atmosphere. Indeed. His hands fidgeted with a matchbox as she wandered to the far end of the room. Behind the mantel clock stood a row of small framed photographs. Villages, a regiment in uniform, a woman in nurse's whites smiling uncertainly at the camera. Tuppence adjusted one frame idly, and it tipped forward slightly, revealing something wedged behind it. She slid it free with careful fingers, a photograph, slightly yellowed, showing 3 people, Lydia Benton unmistakably at the centre, flanked by 2 men in uniform whose faces were unfamiliar. One stood too close, his hand barely grazing her shoulder. The other stood stiffly apart. Your predecessor, perhaps? She asked lightly, showing it to Aubrey. He blinked, startled. I don't believe I've seen that before. How odd. May I keep it for a bit? He hesitated, then shrugged. If you wish. I've no sentimental claim to it. Tommy was watching him closely now, noting the nervous flicker of his eyes, the quick way he changed the subject. You said you're cataloguing old letters, Tommy said. Any luck with military records from 1918? A little, Aubrey said. Mostly mundane correspondence, supply lists, patient logs, that sort of thing. Nothing dramatic. The pause before that last word was a trifle too long. They stayed for another half hour, the conversation flowing politely over the shallows of safer topics. When they finally took their leave, Tuppence cast one last glance around the house. Everything seemed too carefully arranged, too undisturbed, as if someone were preserving not a home but a tableau. Outside, the mist had thickened again, cloaking the trees along the lane. As they walked away, Tuppence tucked the photograph into her coat pocket. Well, said Tommy, what do you make of our scholarly recluse? I make him nervous, she said cheerfully, which is always promising. They had gone perhaps 200 yards when a voice called softly behind them. It was the inn's maid, a thin girl with anxious eyes and reddened hands, hurrying down the road. Beg pardon, miss, she said breathlessly, glancing back toward the house as if afraid it might follow her. You was asking about Miss Lydia. You should talk to her sister, Mrs. Farrow. Lives in the little cottage near the river bend. But mind you, she don't like to speak of the past. Does anyone in this village? Tuppence asked. The girl shivered. Some things don't rest easy here, miss. My mum says the Bentons had bad luck, ever since the war. Thank you, Tuppence said gently. You've been very helpful. The maid curtsied quickly and darted back the way she'd come, disappearing into the fog as if she'd never been there. Tommy slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Friendly little place. Remind me to recommend it to our enemies. That evening, back at the Ivygate Inn, Mrs. Glaston served them supper with her usual forced cheer, but her eyes darted toward the window whenever the wind rattled the panes. The villagers in the taproom spoke in low tones, and more than once Tuppence caught a phrase, the house, the doctor, Haydock's folly. Later, when the inn had quieted, Tuppence stood by the window of their room, looking out over the village green. The fog had thinned under the pale glow of the street lamp. Everything was still, too still. Then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the circle of light, motionless, its face obscured by shadow. It was watching the inn, watching their window. "Tommy," she whispered. He joined her, squinting into the darkness, but by the time he reached the glass, the figure had gone, melted into the mist like a breath extinguished. Tuppence's reflection met her own in the window pane, eyes bright with thought. "Someone's keeping guard over the past," she murmured, "and I'd very much like to know why." Below, the ivy on Benton House rustled faintly in the wind, like something breathing in its sleep. The morning came on quietly, draped in a fine silver mist that softened every outline of Mapleford. Even the chimneys seemed hesitant to smoke too boldly. The clock on the church tower struck 9 with a weary tone, and Tuppence Beresford, already armed with gloves, notebook, and that expression which made even the most tight-lipped villagers speak against their better judgment, declared the day fit for revelations. Tommy, meanwhile, fortified himself with coffee at the inn's breakfast table. "You do realise," he said, buttering toast, "that every time we visit a place with roses and regret, we end up chased, shot at, or nearly poisoned." Tuppence smiled, tying her hat ribbon under her chin. "Nonsense. This time we're simply visiting a grieving sister, hardly the stuff of danger." "Your optimism, my dear, is terrifying." They left the Ivygate Inn and followed a narrow lane that curved out of the village proper. The mist gave way to a faint drizzle, but it only made the countryside seem more secretive. Hedges beaded with rain, blackbirds watching from the branches, and the smell of damp soil rising rich and alive. At last they came upon a small cottage crouched beneath a veil of climbing roses, their blossoms pale and weary from years of neglect. A narrow path led to a green-painted door, and beside it a half-shuttered window held a lace curtain, yellowed with age. Tuppence took one look and whispered, "Yes, definitely regret." Tommy knocked. After a long pause, the door opened just a few inches. A woman stood there, thin, grey-haired, with eyes like faded violets and hands that trembled as they held the edge of the door. "Yes?" she asked softly. "Mrs. Farrow," Tuppence said, her voice warm but cautious. "Forgive us for disturbing you. We're friends of Colonel Haydock. He thought you might help us understand a little about your sister." The woman flinched at the word sister. For a moment it seemed she might close the door altogether. Then, after a fragile silence, she said, "Colonel Haydock, I haven't heard that name in years. You'd better come in before the neighbours start looking." The interior of the cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish and something older, like paper kept too long in drawers. Everything was neat, but nothing was new. A small fire burned in the hearth, giving off more light than heat. "Sit, if you please," Mrs. Farrow said, motioning to the worn armchairs. She took the rocker by the window, folding her hands over her apron. "It's been 20 years, you know. 20 years, and still they come asking about Lydia." "We only wish to understand what truly happened," Tuppence said gently. "She seems to have been quite beloved." A bitter smile. "Beloved? Perhaps, but not safe." Tuppence tilted her head. "Safe." Mrs. Farrow looked into the fire. "My sister was clever. Too clever, some said. During the war, she was stationed at the hospital outside the village. She got letters, odd ones, from officers she'd nursed, or so she claimed. They were always full of nonsense phrases, apple harvest this and violet dusk that. I told her once it sounded like code. She laughed, said I'd been reading too many penny thrillers." Tommy stirred. "And were the letters ever seen by anyone else?" "Not after the last week. She kept them in a box beneath her sewing things. Then one evening she told me she was meeting someone. A friend, she said, though she wouldn't give a name. She left after supper, wearing her grey cloak. It was near the churchyard she went. The next morning, she was dead." The words fell into the small room like stones into deep water. "She'd been sitting in her chair by the window," Mrs. Farrow continued in a whisper. "Looked as though she'd just fallen asleep. Peaceful, but there was something in her face. Fear. Even in death it was there. And the letters. Gone." "Who found her?" Tommy asked quietly. "The doctor, Dr. Albury's father. He was the village physician then. Certified heart failure. No inquest. No one wanted one. She'd always been delicate, they said." "And you believed that?" Tuppence asked. Mrs. Farrow's thin hands twisted in her lap. "I wanted to, But Lydia wasn't delicate. She was frightened. That's not the same thing. She'd taken to the doctor's little sleeping draughts for her nerves, Mrs. Farrow added softly. I warned her those bottles could do more harm than worry ever would. Tuppence leaned forward, her tone coaxing. Did she say who she feared? She wouldn't. She said only that she'd stumbled on something she shouldn't have. It's too late now, she told me once, but perhaps the truth will keep breathing, even if I don't. Mrs. Farrow's voice broke. After that night, the whole village went quiet. They closed around her death like a fist. Colonel Haydock left. The doctor stopped making house calls here. And she faltered. I planted roses, because they grow over everything. The silence that followed was almost tender. The clock ticked on the mantel. Outside, a sparrow scolded from the hedge. At last, Tuppence rose. You've been very brave, Mrs. Farrow. I promise you, we'll be careful with what you've told us. The woman nodded absently. You'll find nothing. But if you must look, start with what Lydia called the violet dusk. She said it meant something to the right eyes. As they stepped out into the lane again, the drizzle had thickened to mist, curling low over the ground. Tommy pulled up his collar. Violet dusk, he mused. Sounds like the sort of code phrase they'd use in the old War Office. Romantic, but practical. She mentioned apple harvest as well, said Tuppence, adjusting her gloves. Perhaps both are part of a pattern. We'll make inquiries at the parish archives later. They started down the path, the cottage shrinking behind them. The quiet seemed heavier now, as though the air itself listened. Halfway to the main road, Tommy stopped abruptly. Someone's at the gate. A shape had appeared in the mist behind them, tall, motionless and watching. It stood beside the rose-covered fence where the pale blossoms looked ghostly in the grey light. Tuppence's breath caught. The same figure from last night? Looks like it. Tommy took a step forward, but the stranger turned and vanished between the hedges. Without a word, Tommy gave chase. The narrow lane twisted between fields, the wet earth sucking at his shoes. The figure moved swiftly, a shadow darting through the fog, then cutting across a stile into the woods. "Stop!" Tommy called, though he knew it was futile. The only answer was the rustle of branches and the beat of his own breath. He lost sight of the man near the bend where the mist thickened to a curtain. When he emerged on the other side, the lane was empty. Only the faint echo of footsteps lingered and then faded. Tuppence caught up moments later, panting slightly. "Did you?" "Gone," he said grimly. "Vanished like smoke." They stood in the quiet lane, listening to the slow drip of rain from the hedges. Then something caught Tommy's eye, a scrap of paper tangled in the thorns. He pulled it free, careful not to tear it further. The writing was smeared but legible enough to send a chill through them both. Violet dusk, truth delayed. Tuppence met his gaze. So it's not just a phrase, it's a message. Or a warning, Tommy said softly, folding the fragment. And whoever left it doesn't want us reading the rest. They walked back toward the village in silence, the road stretching ahead through the fading mist. Behind them, the rose bushes at Agnes Farrow's gate swayed gently in the wind, their blossoms trembling as though stirred by an unseen hand. The past, Tuppence thought, was not buried at all. It was only waiting for the right people to start digging. The afternoon sunlight lay across the village green like spilled honey, catching on the white-painted fences and warming the cobblestones to a gentle glow. From the open windows of the Ivygate Inn drifted the chatter of china cups, the clink of teaspoons, and the unmistakable hum of polite curiosity, a sound as English as drizzle and duty. Mrs. Glaston's tea parties were something of a local ritual, half social event and half tribunal, where everyone's cake was sweet and everyone's opinions sharper than a paring knife. Tuppence had taken care with her appearance, simple dress of navy blue, gloves cream, hat tipped at a knowing angle, the perfect picture of innocent sociability, which, of course, she was not. She leaned toward Tommy as they entered the crowded parlour. "Observe, darling, the battlefield disguised as a bake sale." Tommy murmured back, "We're armed with sandwiches and surrounded by snipers. Proceed with caution." Their hostess, Mrs. Glaston, bustled over, cheeks pink with both pride and perspiration. "He's giving a talk at the Mechanics' Hall this afternoon, something about the village hospitals during the war. 4 o'clock, I think." "Dr. Albury?" Tuppence asked lightly. "Yes, indeed." Mrs. Glaston's smile flickered. He's a fine man, very clever. Spends so much time alone, though, with his books and all. I dare say it isn't healthy. Tuppence returned the smile sweetly. Oh, I quite agree. Solitude invites mischief. Inside, the air shimmered with heat and talk. The long table was spread with lace and loaded with sponge cakes, jam tarts, and a gleaming silver pot of tea that steamed like a locomotive. Around it sat the most respectable assembly Mapleford could muster. There was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pembroke, tall, angular, and radiating the moral chill of a winter sermon. Beside her, the schoolmistress, Miss Ives, whose spectacles magnified eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing. The postmaster, Mr. Colville, round and red-faced, laughed a touch too loudly at nothing in particular. And near the window, looking altogether less comfortable, sat Dr. Albury, his hands folded tightly around a cup he hadn't yet sipped from. Mrs. Glaston made the introductions, fluttering like a nervous pigeon. "Now, everyone, this is Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, our charming visitors from London. They're quite taken with our little village." "Indeed," said Tuppence brightly. "It's full of character, and characters." A few polite chuckles rippled around the table. Mrs. Pembroke, unimpressed, asked, "And what brings you to Mapleford, Mrs. Beresford? Not many visitors this time of year." "Oh, we're fond of old stories," said Tuppence, spooning sugar into her tea. "My husband enjoys military history, and I have a weakness for local legends. We heard this village has both." The remark hung in the air like perfume. The postmaster shifted. Miss Ives adjusted her spectacles. Dr. Albury set down his cup with a small betraying clink. "Legends?" Mrs. Pembroke sniffed. "Nonsense. We are a God-fearing community. No tales here beyond the Bible." Mrs. Glaston laughed a touch too brightly. "Oh, but Mrs. Beresford means the old stories, you know. The war days, the hospital, all that. Best forgotten, if you ask me." "Best forgotten things," said Tuppence lightly, "tend to remember us anyway." There was a murmur, a few smiles, and then quiet. The clink of spoons resumed, hesitant and brittle. Tuppence pretended not to notice. She nibbled a piece of shortbread, her eyes moving from face to face, watching each expression the way a chess player watches the board. Finally, she spoke again, her tone as innocent as afternoon sun. "Someone mentioned a nurse once stationed here. Lydia Benton, I believe her name was. My, what a lovely sound it has." The effect was electric. The vicar's wife froze mid-sip. Miss Ives's teacup rattled in its saucer. The postmaster coughed, spilling a few crumbs onto his waistcoat. And Dr. Albury, poor Dr. Albury, went visibly pale. Mrs. Glaston's smile tightened until it might have cracked. "Ah, yes, Miss Benton. Such a tragedy, poor girl. But so long ago now. We've all moved on." Tuppence dabbed at her lips delicately with a napkin. "Of course. It's simply that her name seems to linger." "I wouldn't say that," said Miss Ives sharply. "No need to dredge up the past. We've all had our sorrows." The postmaster nodded vigorously. "Quite right. Terrible thing, but no mystery about it. Natural causes. Always was." "Oh, indeed," said Tuppence. "How fortunate when life and death are so tidy." Tommy bit back a smile. He'd seen that expression before. His wife's charm was a velvet glove, always pleasant until you realized it was holding a dagger. The conversation turned quickly to safer topics: the weather, the church roof, the price of sugar. Yet under the hum of chatter, something darker pulsed, a collective, careful silence. When Mrs. Glaston rose to refill cups, her hands trembled ever so slightly. As the tea drew to its close, Tuppence found herself near the window beside Dr. Albury. The sunlight caught the edge of his glasses, hiding his eyes. "Dr. Albury," she said pleasantly, "you must find the past quite fascinating, living as you do in that house." He looked up sharply. "Fascinating. I'd call it burdensome. The dead have a way of overstaying their welcome." "Still," she said, "you've chosen quite a place to study history." "It's where the records are," he said curtly. "Nothing more." A shadow crossed his face, guilt or memory, and before Tuppence could press further, he excused himself and left, his chair scraping against the floorboards like an exclamation mark. The gathering broke up soon after. Polite farewells, laughter that didn't reach the eyes, and the shuffle of departing feet. Outside, the air was cooler. The Beresfords stepped into the fading sunlight, pausing beneath the inn's ivy eaves. "Well," Tommy said, "you certainly stirred the pot." Tuppence smiled. "Yes, and the tea leaves look promising. Did you see the doctor's face when I mentioned Lydia?" "I did. I also noticed Mrs. Pembroke nearly exorcised her teacup." Before Tuppence could reply, a hand tugged at her sleeve. She turned to find a small, mousy woman in a shawl, the same maid who'd spoken to her days before. The woman pressed a folded paper into Tuppence's gloved hand. "Read it later," she whispered, and hurried away before Tuppence could respond. They waited until they were back in their room to unfold it. The message was scrawled in an uneven hand. "Don't trust the doctor." Tommy let out a low whistle. Concise, and to the point. Tuppence studied the note thoughtfully. "Everyone we meet seems either terrified of him or of what he might reveal." "Or of what he might remember," Tommy said. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was the vicar himself, a genial-looking man with silver hair and the sort of mild eyes that made confession seem optional. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I wanted to apologize for my wife's manner. The village is sensitive about the war years. We lost many good souls." "I understand completely," Tuppence said. "It must be hard to carry such history in such a small place." "Indeed," he said, and then, after a pause, "If you're genuinely interested in the period, our church holds a few archives from those days. Supplies, correspondence, even shipment records from the hospital. I was cataloguing them myself. If you need to catch Dr. Albury, he often uses the old servants' door around the herb beds, easier for carrying his boxes in and out." Tommy straightened slightly. "Shipment records, you say, from 1918? "Yes, all very dull, I'm afraid. List of medicines, bandages, surgical tools. Still, they're a glimpse into another time." "Oh, I think they might be more revealing than you suspect," Tuppence said with a bright smile. After the vicar left, she turned to Tommy, her eyes gleaming. "Do you see it, darling? Haydock's unfinished business, the missing letters, the strange code. Everything points back to those shipments." Tommy nodded slowly. "And to whoever intercepted them. Perhaps someone in uniform, or behind a post office counter." Tuppence tapped the folded note against her chin, or behind a pair of very nervous spectacles. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the muted sounds of the inn below, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the faint rattle of cups being cleared away. Outside, the village was sinking into twilight, its streets washed in amber light. Somewhere across the green, the bells of the church began to toll, and in that moment, both Tommy and Tuppence felt the weight of something vast and invisible, a web of secrets stretching back through years and lives, tightening with every step they took closer to the truth. The fog had rolled in thick and low by the time Tommy and Tuppence left the warmth of the inn. It clung to the village like a living thing, soft, pale, and faintly luminous, muffling the world to the sound of their own footsteps. The lamps along the green burned as dim halos, each swallowed by the mist only a few feet away. Tuppence buttoned her coat against the chill and glanced back once at the inn's glowing windows. "If this ends with us being buried alive," she murmured, "I hope they'll at least spell my name correctly on the stone." Tommy smiled in the dark. "Morbid humour, dear heart. You're settling into the local mood splendidly." "Morbid humour," she said briskly, "is the only thing keeping me warm." They followed the narrow lane that led toward the church, its stones slick with dew. The clock tower above loomed like a sentinel, its face dim in the fog. Somewhere beyond the gate, the bell tolled the quarter hour, soft and hollow. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. According to Colonel Haydock's note that morning, the sexton was to meet them after Vespers to allow access to the crypt beneath St. Michael's. The church records, he said, had long been stored there. Boxes of ledgers and correspondence most folks hadn't touched since the war years. If Lydia's name appeared anywhere, it would be there. But as they reached the gate, Tuppence noticed something strange. The small lantern left for visitors to light their way had already been extinguished. The path beyond was nothing but shadow. "Charming," she said. "I always prefer my historical research accompanied by mild terror." The churchyard was a maze of leaning gravestones and overgrown grass. The fog seemed to curl and breathe among the markers, as if the past itself was stirring. They made their way toward the crypt, a squat stone structure set into the slope behind the church, its iron door glinting faintly under the light of Tommy's torch. No lantern, no sexton, Tommy muttered. Either someone lured him off or got here first. Tommy's voice lowered. So much for meeting the sexton. Stay close. He pushed the door wide. The hinges groaned and a breath of cold air swept out, old, earthy, and faintly metallic. Inside, their light caught the outlines of stone steps descending into darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from below. Tuppence followed, her heels clicking softly on the worn stone. I do wish, she whispered, someone had told me detective work involved so much archaeology. At the bottom of the steps, the crypt opened into a vaulted chamber. Niches lined the walls, some sealed with marble plaques, others empty. In the centre stood a table strewn with ledgers, brittle papers, and the wreck of a wooden box gnawed by time. Cobwebs hung in thick veils, glinting silver under the beam of the torch. Tommy swept the light over the room. So much for untouched. The vicar's been cataloguing down here, but these fresh footprints definitely aren't his. Tuppence crouched near one of the ledgers. Except, she said, for whoever left these. She pointed to the floor. Fresh footprints, clearly visible in the dust, one set leading in from the door, another crossing toward the far wall. Someone's been poking about recently, Tommy muttered, and they didn't bother to wipe their boots. He handed Tuppence the torch while he examined the wall. It was lined with shelves of relics, brass candlesticks, cracked hymnals, and a scattering of unlabelled keys. Tuppence turned the torch toward a toppled chest, half hidden beneath a torn cloth. Something glinted faintly within. She reached in and drew out a small brass key, its surface dulled with age but still catching the light. Along its handle, engraved in delicate looping letters, were two initials, L.B. Tuppence stared. Lydia Benton. Tommy turned sharply. You're sure? As sure as I am that this isn't a coincidence. Look, the key's finely made, not church property. It's personal. She held it up. And recently touched. There's no dust on it. Before Tommy could answer, a sudden clang rang out from above, the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal. The door. They froze. Then came the slow scrape of hinges and the heavy click of a lock sliding into place. Tuppence drew a sharp breath. Tommy. He was already moving, taking the steps two at a time, his torch beam slicing through the gloom. He tried the handle. It didn't budge. He slammed a fist against the door. Hello? Anyone there? Only silence replied, thick and absolute. Well, said Tuppence after a moment, her voice steady but brittle at the edges. That answers one question. Someone knew we were coming. Tommy examined the latch by torchlight. And they've made quite sure we won't be leaving. The crypt seemed to shrink around them, the air heavy and cold. Tuppence drew her coat closer, peering toward the far end where the stone curved into shadow. If I faint, promise me you'll catch me before I hit anything historical. Don't tempt fate, he muttered, inspecting the lock. Then, after a pause, hand me that iron rod from the table. She passed it to him. He wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame and began to lever it with grim determination. The wood groaned but held. Sweat glistened on his temple despite the chill. You know, Tuppence said conversationally, this reminds me of that time in Nice when we were trapped in the wine cellar. At least then we had provisions. Unless you fancy communion wafers, I'm afraid not. The iron strained again, and with a final wrench the latch snapped. The door creaked open by inches, then wider, letting in a rush of fog and air so cold it burned. Tommy exhaled. Ladies first. Tuppence climbed out, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The churchyard was utterly still. Only the fog moved, curling like smoke around the stones. Then, a sound. Footsteps, quick and retreating, somewhere near the outer wall. There, Tommy said, breaking into a run. They followed the sound through the mist, the beam of the torch swinging wildly ahead. For a moment, they glimpsed a shape, a tall figure moving fast toward the lich gate, its coat flapping behind. The light caught the edge of the fabric, a dark tweed with a faint herringbone pattern. Tuppence gasped. That's Dr. Albury's coat. Tommy was already in pursuit, but the figure vanished through the gate, swallowed by the fog beyond. When they reached the lane, only silence remained, and the mist rolled unbroken ahead. They stood, breathing hard, until the night swallowed even the echo of the chase. "Well," Tuppence said, "either the good doctor moonlights as a grave robber, or someone's borrowing his wardrobe." Tommy turned the torch back toward the church. Either way, that wasn't a casual passer-by. He knew exactly where to find us, and how to keep us there. When they returned to the inn, the lamps were still lit in the parlour. Colonel Haydock sat by the fire, his face lined deeper than ever. He looked up sharply as they entered. "Where the devil have you two been?" he demanded. "I've been pacing for an hour." "In the crypt, Colonel," Tuppence said, "having a rather educational time." She produced the brass key and laid it on the table. "We found this, Lydia Benton's initials." Haydock stared at it, his expression unreadable. "Good Lord," he murmured, "after all these years." Before he could say more, Mrs. Glaston appeared with a folded slip of paper in her hand. "This was left for you, Colonel," she said. "Someone pushed it under the door not 10 minutes ago." He took it, frowning, and unfolded it slowly, his face drained of colour. "It says, 'Stop digging into what was meant to be forgotten.'" Tuppence met Tommy's eyes. The phrase echoed with an eerie familiarity, the very words Haydock himself had used the night they arrived. "Who brought it?" Tommy asked quickly. "No one saw," Mrs. Glaston said, nervously twisting her apron. "The street was empty when I opened the door." The Colonel crushed the note in his fist. "This confirms it. Someone in this village is determined to keep the past buried, and they're willing to frighten, or worse, to do it." Tuppence looked toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the glass like a living curtain. Somewhere out there, a figure in a doctor's coat was walking home through the mist, alone, or pretending to be. She turned back to the fire, her face lit by its flickering glow. "Then I suppose we'd better keep digging," she said softly, "because whoever wants the past forgotten has just reminded us how very much it matters." The brass key gleamed faintly on the table between them, catching the firelight like an eye that refused to close. The fire in the inn's parlour had burned down to a steady glow, the kind of amber light that softens hard edges and makes secrets seem ready to spill. Colonel Haydock sat in the high-backed chair nearest the hearth, his face half in shadow, half in the flicker of flame. The brass key Tuppence had found lay on the table between them, gleaming faintly as though it too had something to confess. He'd been silent for several minutes, pipe forgotten in his hand, gaze fixed on the embers. Tommy and Tuppence waited, the former with the patience of a man who'd learned not to interrupt confessions, the latter with the sharpened alertness of one who sensed that everything was about to turn. When Haydock finally spoke, his voice had changed. It had lost the soldier's command and gained the tremor of memory. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "One spends 20 years trying to forget, and the past simply walks in wearing a new coat." "You mean Dr. Albury's?" Tuppence said softly. His eyes flicked toward her, surprised by her accuracy. "So you've guessed?" "Yes. The boy wears his father's face. Every time he looked at me across that blasted tea table, I saw the man I failed to expose." Tommy leaned forward. "Start from the beginning, Colonel. What was Lydia Benton's part in it?" He exhaled, the smoke from his pipe curling upward like the ghost of a battlefield. "I was in charge of a confidential courier network in 1917, coded intelligence passing through medical channels. On paper, it was a system for reporting wounded personnel. In reality, it was how we transmitted movements, strategic adjustments, and the occasional delicate matter." He paused. "Hospitals made perfect cover. No one suspects a nurse of espionage." "And Lydia was one of those nurses?" asked Tuppence. "Yes, intelligent girl. Too intelligent. She suspected one of the couriers, someone high enough to access the codes, was selling information. I told her to leave it to me, but she said she had proof. A letter. She'd found it hidden among the hospital records." "And then she died," Tuppence said quietly. Haydock's gaze dropped to the brass key. "She asked to meet me the night before. Said she couldn't keep it any longer, that she'd found the rotten apple in the barrel, as she put it. But He swallowed hard. "I didn't go. There was another matter, a command visit, orders to draft a new code. I thought it could wait until morning, only it was morning when I heard she'd been found dead in her rooms, and the letter had vanished." Tommy said nothing. The silence of the room seemed to absorb the admission like dry sand taking water. After a long pause, Haydock went on. The coroner ruled it natural causes, heart failure. I knew better. She wasn't the sort to simply die of fright. But I had no proof, only whispers. The doctor who signed the certificate was Dr. Albury Sr. His manner was peculiar, too brisk, too tidy. And afterward, I found out he'd had access to the same correspondence channels Lydia did. There were rumours he'd been under financial strain, debts. Nothing official, of course. The War Office buried it all. And I, coward that I was, let them. Tuppence's voice was very soft. You think he was the traitor? I think he was involved, said Haydock. And if not the man himself, someone using his credentials. A message came through a week after her death, coded, clever, buried in the margin of an otherwise ordinary medical report. It referred to a meeting under the phrase violet dusk. I remember that distinctly because Lydia used the same term in her notes. Tommy looked toward Tuppence. The same code Mrs. Farrow mentioned. She nodded. And the same phrase on the scrap we found in the hedge. Violet dusk, truth delayed. Haydock's head jerked up. You found that? Tommy handed him the fragment, smoothed and faintly damp from their pockets. The old soldier stared at it as though it were a relic dug from his own guilt. Then she really did try to warn me, he murmured. Good God, after all these years she's still speaking. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Beyond the window, the fog pressed against the glass like a pale wall. Tuppence leaned back, watching him with that particular sympathy she reserved for men undone by conscience. You're not the only one who's tried to bury the past, Colonel. Mapleford seems to specialise in it. But if Dr. Albury's father was mixed up in this, we have to ask why the son's so intent on keeping us out of Benton House. Haydock frowned. I've wondered that. Perhaps the boy discovered something, papers, records, and doesn't want the scandal. Or perhaps he's trying to finish what his father began. Tommy's tone was practical. Let's consider the possibilities. 1. The father was guilty, the son's covering for him. 2. The father was innocent. The son's trying to clear the name and doesn't trust us. 3. Both were in it together somehow, and this is generational rot. Tuppence gave a half smile. Or 4. There's another player entirely, and the Alburys are merely ghosts in the same hall. Haydock rubbed a hand over his brow. You think there's still someone alive, someone who benefited? I think, said Tuppence, someone has gone to a great deal of trouble to keep Lydia Benton's story dead. That suggests the secret still matters. Tommy reached for the key on the table, holding it up to the firelight. This, for instance, it must have opened something important, too finely made for an ordinary drawer, and Lydia's initials weren't engraved for vanity. It was meant for her hand alone. Where do you suppose it fits? Asked Haydock. Tuppence's gaze sharpened. She worked at the hospital, but that building's gone. The next most likely places are where her records ended up. Either the church archives or Benton House, the doctor's residence. Where his son now lives, Tommy added grimly. Haydock stirred uneasily. If that key opens something in Benton House, you'll never get near it while the lad's there. He's secretive enough already. Tuppence smiled faintly. I have my ways, and a knack for tea-time visits. Tommy shot her a sidelong glance, which usually end in explosions, literal or social. Progress, darling. Always looks like chaos in the moment. Haydock gave a dry chuckle that ended in a cough. You remind me of your generation's best and worst qualities, Mrs. Beresford, persistence and impertinence in equal measure. Tuppence accepted it as a compliment. Thank you, Colonel. Both have kept me alive. He looked again at the key, then at the two of them. If you're right, if this is still about that code, then you must tread carefully. During the war, men killed for less than what was in those letters. Some of the information we passed could still be valuable, even now. Trade routes, old alliances, leverage never dies, it merely changes hands. Tommy nodded. And the one holding it now is willing to frighten or kill to keep it. Haydock leaned back, eyes distant. When I received that note tonight, stopped digging into what was meant to be forgotten. I knew it was more than an idle threat. I'd seen that handwriting once before, in a requisition form dated 1918, signed under Dr. Albury Sr.'s supervision. Tuppence sat upright. You're certain? Quite. The loop of the D, the break in the S. You don't forget those things when you've spent years checking signatures against forged orders. Tommy's brows rose. So the son may have inherited more than his father's overcoat. Haydock stared into the fire again. I always thought time would dull the guilt. Instead, it's sharpened it. Lydia Benton died because I didn't believe her urgency. If her spirit is wandering, she deserves better than the silence we've given her. Tuppence's tone softened. Then help us break it. You knew the system, the codes, the patterns. Violet dusk might have been a signal phrase, but what about apple harvest? That appeared in her letters too. He looked at her sharply. Apple harvest, yes. That was a schedule term, designating a particular route of couriers between the southern hospitals and London, each phrase paired with a time. Violet dusk meant transmission due at evening. Apple harvest meant dispatch from field to capital. If someone used those codes outside the system, it would indicate illicit communication. Tommy sat back. Meaning whoever sent those messages wasn't just a thief of information. They were using the courier line itself to smuggle it out. Haydock nodded grimly. Exactly. Lydia must have realized that. And whoever killed her, if she was killed, did so to intercept the next dispatch. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly. At last, Tuppence rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the fog had thinned into pale ribbons drifting over the green. The church bell struck 10, its echo rolling through the night. It's strange, she said. Every answer brings us back to that house, the Alburys, Lydia's death, the key. The past hasn't left Mapleford at all. It's been waiting for the right knock on the door. Tommy joined her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. Then tomorrow, we knock. Behind them, Colonel Haydock stared into the flames as though trying to read the future in their dance. If you go to Benton House, he said slowly, go before dark. And whatever you find, don't underestimate its worth. Secrets like these don't die quietly. Tuppence turned back toward him. Nor do we, Colonel. Not while a woman's truth lies locked behind a key. He smiled faintly, the soldier's grim humour returning for a moment. Then God help Mapleford, he said. The clock chimed again, the sound low and final. Outside, the fog drifted against the windows once more, thickening as though to conceal the world beyond. And in its quiet fold, 3 figures sat around a dying fire, the brass key between them gleaming like a promise or a curse, waiting to be turned. The rain came without warning that afternoon, sweeping across Mapleford in sudden silver sheets that blurred the cottages and turned the cobblestones slick and shining. It was the sort of rain that erased sound, save for the steady patter against glass and the rhythmic drip from the inn's eaves. Inside, Tuppence sat by the window of their room, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notebook. His lecture starts at 4, she said. That gives us precisely 2 hours before Dr. Albury returns to Benton House. Tommy, pacing the room with the restlessness of a man about to commit a minor felony, adjusted his hat in the mirror. You make it sound like a tea engagement. We're breaking into the home of a man who may or may not be the son of a wartime traitor. Tuppence closed her notebook with a soft snap. Yes, dear, and if we wait for his permission, we'll still be here when the next war begins. Remind me, he said, picking up his raincoat, why I married you. For my moral restraint, she replied, pulling on her gloves. The rain softened to a drizzle as they reached Benton House. The ivy that climbed its facade glistened, each leaf a droplet mirror. The windows were dark except for the faint flicker of the drawing-room fire, visible through a crack in the curtains. Tuppence tried the front door, locked of course. The study's at the back, Tommy murmured. The vicar said Albury uses the old servants' entrance sometimes. They made their way around the side of the house, past the overgrown herb garden and the tangle of vines along the kitchen wall. A narrow door, half hidden by the ivy, yielded after a determined shove. They slipped inside, closing it quietly behind them. The air was cool and faintly scented with polish and damp wood. The silence was heavy, the kind of silence that houses keep when they've been watching for too long. Tuppence struck a match and lit a small candle she'd brought along. Its trembling flame cast uneasy shadows across the panelled corridor. "Where do you suppose we begin?" she whispered. "Studies are creatures of habit," Tommy murmured. "Men who read secrets and drink whiskey rarely keep either far from arm's reach." They found the study easily enough, a square room panelled in dark oak, lined with shelves of medical volumes and history texts. The heavy desk bore stacks of papers, neat as a surgeon's tray, and the air smelled faintly of tobacco and lavender wax. Tommy began searching the desk drawers while Tuppence examined the bookshelves. "Nothing incriminating here," he said after a moment. "Bills, notes on hospital supply chains, and a perfectly respectable letter from a publisher about an article on medieval surgery." Tuppence, undeterred, pressed along the spines of the books. "You know," she mused, "I've always found it suspicious how often people conceal things behind Shakespeare. It's as though poor Will were forever colluding with conspirators." One of the shelves gave a faint click beneath her hand. She stepped back. "Tommy." He turned just as she pressed again. The shelf shifted slightly, then swung inward, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind the bookcase. The air that escaped was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. "Well," said Tuppence, "either we've found the heart of the mystery or the pantry." Tommy produced his torch. The beam cut through the gloom to reveal a small chamber beyond, barely more than a closet, its walls lined with filing cabinets and a single desk. On the desk sat a metal box, dull with age, its brass lock gleaming faintly in the light. The sight of it made Tuppence's pulse quicken. "It matches the key, Tommy. It must." She drew the small brass key from her pocket, its engraved initials glinting softly, L.B. It slid into the lock with uncanny ease. The latch clicked open. Tommy leaned in beside her. Inside the box lay a stack of papers bound with a faded blue ribbon and several loose sheets covered in Lydia Benton's precise handwriting. Atop them rested a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, marked to C.H., confidential. Tuppence whispered, "C.H., Colonel Haydock." They exchanged a glance, then Tommy unfolded the first of the diary pages. The handwriting was elegant, hurried, and full of tension. "March 17th. I fear the message has gone astray. Dr. A insists all transmissions are accounted for, yet one is missing, the one I warned Colonel H about. He will not believe me, but I know the handwriting that copied our codes. It was from within the hospital itself. If I cannot reach him tonight, I shall go alone." Tommy read another. "March 18th. I have made my decision. The truth must be told, even if it costs my life. The apple harvest was tainted from the start. I pray he will understand when he sees this." And another, the final entry, March 19th. "They are coming tonight. I can hear footsteps outside. I have hidden the rest with the key. If they find me, at least the truth may one day reach him. Violet dusk shall be my signal." Tuppence looked up. She knew she was going to die. Tommy nodded grimly. And she trusted Haydock to find this box, which means someone intercepted it before he ever had the chance. Tuppence picked up the envelope marked 2CH and carefully slit it open. Inside was a single folded sheet, typed, not handwritten. The message was brief, but devastating. "Colonel, your system has been compromised. The courier network leaks through our own medical reports. Information sold to enemy hands via your own code. This exposure cost lives. You are advised to cease transmissions at once. S." Tuppence's eyes widened. That implicates him directly. He must have been in charge of the system Lydia discovered. Tommy frowned. It's not evidence of betrayal. It's evidence of error. Whoever sent this, S, was warning him that his method had been hijacked. "And Lydia found out," Tuppence murmured. "She died before she could prove whether Haydock was the fool or the scapegoat." She sorted through the rest of the contents. Scraps of coded messages, partially burned telegrams, a list of numbers that looked like cipher keys. One note, smudged and faint, read, "Payment received. Second parcel follows via Albury." Tommy exhaled slowly. That settles it. Dr. Albury's father was the courier, the go-between. Tuppence's brows knitted. Then why hide this room? Why keep her diary at all unless the son wanted to uncover the truth? Before Tommy could answer, the faint crunch of footsteps outside froze them both. A door closed somewhere in the house, then another. Tuppence's eyes widened. He's back. Tommy doused the torch, plunging the small chamber into darkness. They could hear the soft creak of floorboards in the next room, the unmistakable rhythm of someone moving with care, not surprise. Tuppence whispered, "He knows." The footsteps drew nearer. The door to the study opened. A line of light spilled across the floor, faintly illuminating the edges of the hidden door. Then, without warning, the shelf swung outward. Dr. Aubrey stood there, raincoat still damp, a lantern in his hand and a revolver in the other. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp with fury and fear in equal measure. "So," he said softly, "you found it." Tommy raised his hand slowly. "We might phrase that as happened upon, if you're inclined toward leniency." "Don't mock me, Mr. Beresford." Aubrey stepped closer, the gun steady. "That box belonged to my father. You had no right." "Nor did he," said Tuppence sharply. "He was using the courier system to pass information to the enemy, wasn't he?" Something flickered in Aubrey's face. Pain, then anger. "That's a lie. He was innocent, misled perhaps, but not a traitor. I've spent years trying to prove it. Everything in that box is proof that he was being framed." "By whom?" Tommy asked. Aubrey hesitated, then gestured toward the papers. "Read the letters. Lydia Benton was blackmailed into silence. My father knew her well. They worked together. Someone threatened her, forced her to destroy the evidence. When she refused, they killed her." Tuppence's tone softened. "Then why not show this to Colonel Haydock? He's been haunted by this for years." "Because," Aubrey said bitterly, "the note addressed to him proves he caused it. His system was flawed, his code exposed. If the truth came out, he'd be branded the architect of betrayal." "Then Lydia died protecting him," said Tuppence quietly. "Perhaps," Aubrey muttered, "but I've lost my reputation once. I won't lose it again to satisfy his conscience." Before anyone could speak further, a sharp crack shattered the air. The lamp on the desk exploded, glass scattering like rain. The room plunged into darkness. "Down!" Tommy shouted, pulling Tuppence to the floor. Another shot followed, splintering the wood of the doorframe. Aubrey's lantern went out, plunging the house into near total blackness. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Somewhere beyond the broken window, footsteps thudded in retreat. Tommy was first to rise, edging toward the shattered glass. Through the rain and the fog, he caught a glimpse of a dark figure disappearing into the hedgerow. "Gone," he muttered. "Whoever it was knew the layout, and our timing." Aubrey stood by the wall, breathing hard, the gun still trembling in his hand. "And if you saw my herringbone coat on anyone skulking about," he added grimly, "it was likely Edward Colville. The lads borrowed it often enough for errands." Tuppence straightened, brushing glass from her sleeve. "Then we've done something right," she said, "because now they're frightened." She looked down at the fallen diary pages scattered across the floor, their edges curling in the candlelight. The words seemed almost alive in the flicker, fragments of a story buried too long. Tommy extinguished the last flame with a cautious hand. "We'd better go," he said quietly, "before the village wakes to another scandal." They left through the side door into the rain, the darkness closing behind them. The windows of Benton House glowed faintly for a moment, then went dark again, like a secret retreating into silence. As they reached the lane, Tuppence looked back. The box was meant for Haydock, and Lydia died before she could deliver it. Whoever shot at us tonight is the same person who wanted her quiet. Tommy nodded grimly. "And now that we've opened her box, they'll try again." The rain thickened, hissing on the stones as they walked away. Behind them, the house loomed like a shadow among the trees, its secrets no longer safe, its silence no longer complete. The morning after the gunshot dawned grey and restless, the kind of day when even the sparrows seemed uncertain whether to sing. A soft drizzle clung to the panes of the Ivygate Inn, blurring the world beyond into a watercolour of muted tones. Inside, the fire burned low, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and tea. Tuppence sat at the small table by the window, Lydia Benton's diary spread open before her. Her brow was furrowed, a pencil tapping absently against her lip. Tommy, half awake and wholly in need of coffee, was watching her with the wary respect of a man who knew his wife was about to make the universe behave. "I don't like that look," he said at last, breaking the silence. "It usually means you've seen something I've missed, and it usually ends with me getting rained on." Tuppence didn't glance up. "Nonsense, darling. This time it will be quite dry, metaphorically speaking." "That's not reassuring." She turned a page, her eyes sharp. "Listen to this. The apple harvest report must go through on the 14th, though it's late in the season. CH insists on it. The timing matters more than the content. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Tommy frowned, stretching his legs. If it's about coded messages, the timing might relate to cipher shifts, rotations of code words. We used similar systems during the war. Exactly, she tapped the entry. But everyone focused on the words, apple harvest, violet dusk, and so on. What if the dates were part of the code too? He straightened a little, now fully awake. You mean she embedded meaning in the schedule itself? Tuppence smiled. My clever husband. Yes, Lydia was no amateur. She was a nurse trusted with classified correspondence. If the content was intercepted, the dates themselves could carry the real message. She spread the diary flat, revealing a sequence of entries. Look, she wrote the dates like this: 14-9, 17-9, 19-9, 22-9. Those aren't random. There's a rhythm. 3 days, 2, 3. It repeats across all her entries. Tommy reached for his notebook. A pattern of intervals. Morse, perhaps? 3, 2, 3, ... Or, she said softly, a name. She flipped back a few pages. Look at the initials she uses beside them. Tiny marks in the margins. C-O-L-V, then later I-L-L. Tommy's pencil froze. Colville. The postmaster, Tuppence said, her voice low. The man who handled all the mail, all the wartime correspondence, who laughed just a little too quickly when Lydia's name came up at the tea. Tommy's expression darkened. Good Lord. He was the link between the field hospitals and London couriers. He'd have seen every dispatch. And he had access to every coded letter, Tuppence finished. He must have intercepted Lydia's message before it reached Haydock. When she realised someone within Mapleford was leaking information, she probably confronted him. And paid for it with her life. Not exactly, Tuppence said quietly. Her final entry doesn't sound like a woman expecting murder. It sounds like one preparing to act. I think she knew Colville would come for her, and she let him believe she'd destroyed the evidence. It's why she hid the box and left the key where we found it. Tommy leaned back, exhaling. So the clue they forgot wasn't the diary, wasn't the code, it was the timing itself. Tuppence nodded slowly. The one detail everyone overlooked, because people always forget the ordinary, days, dates, times, but Lydia used them as the backbone of her truth. She closed the diary, her expression set. We need to see Mr. Colville. The post office sat at the edge of the green, a prim little building with its brass plaque polished to an almost moral shine. Inside, the smell of ink and dust hung heavy, mingling with the faint tang of damp paper. Mr. Colville himself stood behind the counter, sorting letters with the briskness of a man who took comfort in routine. His round face looked redder than usual, though whether from exertion or unease was hard to tell. From the back room a young voice called, "Uncle, these parcels for the mechanics' hall," and Colville barked, "Yes, Edward, mind you don't smudge the stamps." "Just tying up a few loose ends," Tuppence replied lightly. "We thought we might post a letter, though I suppose you'd know best how to ensure it arrives safely." Something flickered behind his spectacles. Naturally. Reliability is the backbone of my trade. Tommy leaned casually against the counter. "And of yours during the war, wasn't it? You handled the hospital dispatches for the southern sector." Colville's smile stiffened. "Briefly, yes. Routine work, nothing worth remembering." "Funny," said Tuppence, setting Lydia's diary gently on the counter, "because Lydia Benton seemed to think otherwise." He went still. The ticking of the wall clock filled the pause. Tommy's tone remained conversational. "We found her diary, quite a thorough record, including her correspondence dates, and a rather interesting pattern in them." Colville's throat moved as he swallowed. "You've no right. Those are official documents." "Hardly," said Tuppence. "A woman's personal notes about her fear, her conscience, her discovery of betrayal. She hid them for a reason, Mr. Colville, just as you hid your own tracks." "I don't know what you're implying." His voice trembled now, though he tried to mask it with indignation. "I was a civil servant, a loyal one." Tommy's eyes were steady. "Then you won't mind explaining how messages from Colonel Haydock's network ended up intercepted and sold through foreign channels, or why your handwriting matches the requisition forms he received anonymously." Colville's composure cracked like glass under strain. I didn't sell anything. Not at first. It was just information, worthless things, lists, schedules. Everyone was doing it, small trades, and then it became dangerous. And Lydia found out, Tuppence said softly. His hands trembled as they gripped the counter. She came to me, yes, said she'd seen the patterns, that she'd tell Haydock. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She said some secrets weren't hers to keep. So I begged her, told her it would ruin lives. She left that night, and the next morning, she was dead, said Tommy. Colville's eyes glistened. I didn't touch her. She died before I even reached her. I swear it. Tuppence's tone was measured. Yet someone locked the crypt on us last night, and someone fired through the study window. His breath hitched. That wasn't me. It was my nephew, Edward. Fool boy. He thought you'd found the letters and meant to burn them. I told him to frighten you, nothing more. I never meant for... He broke off, burying his face in his hands. I've lived with this for 20 years. Every letter, every stamp. Reminders of what I destroyed. When Haydock came back asking questions, I knew it was only a matter of time. I sent him that warning. I just wanted it to end. Tuppence's expression softened slightly. Then why confess now? He looked up, tears streaking his ruddy face. Because she wasn't wrong. Lydia Benton was the only honest soul among us, and we all let her die believing no one would care. The door creaked open behind them. Colonel Haydock stood in the doorway, his greatcoat dark with rain, his face pale but resolute. I care, he said quietly. Colville turned, startled. Colonel, I didn't... Save it, Haydock interrupted. He stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with authority. You think confession restores the dead? It doesn't, but it might redeem the living. Colville sagged, defeated. You'll turn me in, of course. The constable will forward it to the coroner, he went on quietly. Best the records show misadventure rather than murder, but at least it will be truth this time. But the greater shame isn't yours alone. I built a system too easy to corrupt. Men like you only slip through because I believed in the structure, not the souls within it. A long silence filled the room, the quiet of old guilt meeting its mirror. Tuppence broke it gently. There's one thing I don't understand. Lydia's death. If you didn't cause it, who did? Colville shook his head slowly. No one. She wasn't murdered, not in the way we imagined. The doctor said heart failure, and he wasn't wrong. She'd taken a sleeping draught before I arrived, left the fire burning low. When I found her, she was still warm, but gone. There was no struggle, no mark. Tommy frowned. You're saying she took her own life? No, said Tuppence softly. Her eyes had gone distant, recalling the diary's final line. She wrote, If they find me, at least the truth may one day reach him. She must have realized the danger and chosen to appear dead before they could silence her. Perhaps the dose was too strong. She meant to protect the secret, not end her life. Haydock bowed his head. A soldier's courage in a nurse's heart. Colville wiped his eyes. I thought she'd expose me. I never guessed she'd die trying to save others. The rain eased outside, a faint glimmer of light breaking through the clouds. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Tuppence closed the diary and slid it across the counter toward Haydock. It belongs to her now, she said softly. And to you. The truth's come home. The colonel took it in both hands, his eyes glistening. Thank you, Mrs. Beresford. You and your husband have done what I never could. Tommy smiled faintly. We just followed the breadcrumbs someone else left behind. Haydock gave a short nod, then turned to Colville. The constable's on his way. Best you prepare yourself. The postmaster sagged into his chair, the strength leaving him. The ticking of the wall clock resumed its slow, relentless rhythm, marking the final minutes of a story too long delayed. Outside, the clouds began to lift, the drizzle thinning into mist. Tommy and Tuppence stepped out into the pale light of early afternoon. The air smelled clean, almost hopeful. Tuppence slipped her arm through Tommy's. You know, she said thoughtfully, Lydia was right all along. The truth doesn't vanish, it just waits for someone foolish enough to dig it up. Tommy smiled sideways at her. Foolishness has its uses. So, tea at the inn, or shall we see if the colonel has whiskey to spare? Both, she said. We've earned it. They walked down the lane together, the village quiet behind them, its secrets finally at rest. But as they passed the churchyard gate, Tuppence paused, glancing toward the old stones glistening under the soft rain. She whispered, almost to herself, "Sleep well, Lydia Benton." The message got through. And with that, they continued on, two small figures beneath a clearing sky, leaving Mapleford to its silence and the faint echo of a story the world had almost forgotten. The rain that had so stubbornly clung to Mapleford for days had at last grown tired of its own persistence. By afternoon, the clouds had scattered into streaks of silver and pearl, and the cobbles of the village green gleamed as though freshly polished by contrition. A soft wind wandered through the lanes, carrying the smell of wet lilac and freshly baked bread. It was, Tuppence decided, the sort of day that made even secrets seem lighter. The Ivygate Inn was in rare form, fire-bright, brass-polished, and the hum of quiet satisfaction rippling through its rooms. Mrs. Glaston had declared, with the solemnity of a coronation, that Mapleford was returning to its proper self, by which she meant a place where gossip was domestic rather than dangerous. Tommy and Tuppence had taken their usual corner by the hearth, a pot of tea steaming between them. The chairs around them were gradually filling with familiar faces, the vicar and his wife, Miss Ives, the schoolmistress, and even a subdued Dr. Albury, who looked years older than when they'd first met him. Colonel Haydock sat beside the window, his cane propped nearby, his gaze fixed on the green beyond as though seeing both past and present in the same view. "Another cup, Colonel?" Mrs. Glaston asked, hovering with her teapot. He smiled faintly. "I think not, my dear lady. I've had quite enough stimulants for one lifetime." There was a murmur of laughter, though polite, as if everyone sensed laughter was permitted again, but dared not yet ring too loudly. Tuppence stirred her tea with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "It's curious," she said, "how something as small as a date in a diary can change the course of 20 years. People build whole lives on forgetting things, and then the forgotten decides to be remembered." Tommy gave a short, fond chuckle. "You do have a talent for making espionage sound poetic." "Someone has to," she said, "or we'd all drown in red tape and cipher sheets." The vicar leaned forward, eyes kind but curious. "You mean to say the whole business hinged on that? The dates?" "Yes," said Tommy, "the dates, and Lydia Benton's extraordinary precision. She left the trail for someone clever enough or nosy enough to follow it." "Which, of course, meant Tuppence," he added. Tuppence raised an eyebrow. "Modesty is such an attractive quality in you, darling. Do go on pretending you had nothing to do with it." Miss Ives tutted softly. "I still can't believe Mr. Colville, of all people. So respectable, so rotund." "Respectability," Tuppence said, "has been the downfall of more villains than vice ever was. It makes them think no one will look behind the curtain." Mrs. Glaston, whose sense of discretion was as sharp as her rolling pin, sighed deeply. "And to think I let him run the church raffle. Well, I dare say prison food will sort him out." Haydock's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You were right, Mrs. Beresford. It wasn't treason. It was fear. Fear and vanity. Men do worse things out of shame than they ever would for greed." He looked down at his cup, then up again, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "I used to think Lydia's death was the punishment for my own blindness. Now I see it was her courage that kept the rot from spreading further. She died to save what was left of our decency." There was a quiet in the room, the sort that wraps a truth instead of smothering it. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and somewhere in the kitchen someone dropped a spoon. Dr. Albury cleared his throat. "My father's name has carried a shadow for most of my life. You've lifted that, both of you. I can't pretend to forgive him for his part in it, but I can at least remember him as more than the sum of his mistakes." Tuppence reached across and poured him a fresh cup of tea, her voice gentle. "That's all anyone can ask for, Doctor. Remembering correctly is the best kind of forgiveness." Mrs. Glaston, who had been fighting tears behind her apron, suddenly straightened. "Well, if we go on at this rate, we'll have the entire village in tears. Let's have some cheer, shall we? I've baked my best scones, unless, of course, you two detectives have hidden them as evidence." Tommy grinned. "Only if the case involved clotted cream." "That depends," said Tuppence, pretending gravity. "Is the jam applied before or after?" Mrs. Glaston gasped in mock horror. "Heathens! We're not in Devon!" The laughter that followed this was genuine and warm, the sort that banished the last ghosts from the corners. Even Miss Ives allowed herself a small smile, though it looked as though it had to be coaxed from long retirement. As plates appeared and cups were refilled, the conversation turned to safer subjects: the state of the vicarage roof, the forthcoming fete, the perennial disappointment of the cricket club. Yet beneath it all ran an unspoken gratitude, a shared sense that Mapleford had survived something larger than a scandal. Later, as twilight drifted over the green and the lamps began to glow, Tommy leaned closer to his wife. "You know," he said, "for once I'm rather looking forward to a quiet week. No murders, no crypts, no mysterious doctors lurking about." Tuppence smiled, eyes glinting in the firelight. "My dear Tommy, that's what you said after the affair of the amber comb, and look where that led." "Yes, but this time I mean it." "Of course you do." She sipped her tea serenely. "And if a telegram arrives tomorrow begging us to look into something ghastly in Devon, I suppose you'll decline politely and return to pruning the roses?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I might read the telegram first." "There it is," she said triumphantly. "Hopeless. You'll never be a man of leisure." "I could manage it if you weren't always dragging me into adventure." "Rubbish," said Tuppence cheerfully. "You'd be bored stiff without me. Besides, we make a rather good pair, logic and instinct, brains and brilliance." He laughed. "I notice I'm not listed under either category." She smiled with mock sweetness. "Oh, you are, under brawn and tea-making capacity." At that, Mrs. Glastonbury appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "You two do sound just like a wireless serial. I half expect to hear dramatic music whenever you pause for breath." Tommy raised his cup in salute. "We'll take that as a compliment." "It wasn't meant as one," she said, but her eyes twinkled all the same. "Now you'll stay the night, won't you? Mapleford feels quite proud to have had such company, and we've yet to solve the case of the missing scones." "The missing?" Tuppence began, glancing toward the empty tray. Mrs. Glaston folded her arms. "I baked a dozen. I count only 9. Someone in this very room is a culprit." There was a dramatic gasp from the vicar's wife, a guilty giggle from Miss Ives, and a muffled cough from Haydock. Tommy leaned toward Tuppence. "I should warn you, my dear. I can't account for my actions when jam is involved." "Then you'd better make a full confession," she said sternly. "Very well," he said, lowering his voice. "I took one for evidence and ate it for research." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded, and in that instant the long shadows of the past seemed finally to dissolve. Outside, the last of the rain clouds drifted away, revealing a slice of pale evening sky. The church bell tolled 7, soft, unhurried, and entirely at peace. Colonel Haydock rose slowly, hat in hand. "I'll take my leave," he said. "There's something rather healing about hearing the bells again." He looked at the Beresfords, his gaze steady and full of quiet gratitude. "You've done more than solve a mystery, you know. You've set a spirit free, perhaps 2. Tuppence inclined her head. "Then our work here is done." Haydock smiled faintly. "Until the next village with too much charm and too many secrets calls your name." Tommy groaned good-naturedly. "Heaven forbid." As the colonel departed, the others drifted toward the door, leaving only the Beresfords by the fire. The flames had burned low again, their glow softening to a steady amber. Tuppence leaned back, watching them. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "how many stories like this are buried under polite smiles and afternoon teas?" Tommy looked into his cup, then at her. "Probably most of them, but we can't dig up the whole world, can we?" She smiled. "No, just the corners that need a little light." Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain-washed roses through the open window. The clock struck the half-hour, calm and unhurried. Tuppence set down her cup, content. "Promise me one thing, Tommy." "What's that?" "The next mystery we take on. Let it at least involve daylight." He grinned. "And perhaps fewer crypts." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, fewer crypts perhaps, but I make no promises about danger." He laughed, stood and offered his arm. "Then come along, Mrs. Beresford. Let's leave Mapleford before someone decides to die in the breakfast room." Arm in arm they stepped out into the fading light, the door closing softly behind them. Across the village the lamps were beginning to glow, one by one, small, steady beacons of peace reclaiming their place after darkness. And somewhere, far off, a train whistle echoed, a reminder that the world beyond Mapleford was waiting, full of roads still to be walked, mysteries still to be found, and, inevitably, tea still to be taken.